do mainly layers in watercolor. And watercolor lends itself to layers so wonderfully. I like to deal with the spiritual, and so layers of this misty, see-through, translucent that you get, the ethereal, they just lend themselves to my subjects. And I hope that you'll have the time to look at some of my finished works, because sometimes if I'm doing just a long demo, I still have several pieces and do it sort of like Rachel Ray, or some, that I'll have one in the oven, and I'll have one, and I'll have different stages. But in 15 or 20 minutes, we can't do that. But I know from a distance you can see a background, and so I have a little light drawing on here. And I got this by putting my watercolor on paper. It's wet on wet, and adding the colors that I wanted. And then I used a combination of large ice cream salt and just plain table salt from a shaker that I use on most of these to give it a beautiful texture. I like layering textures. And also I used plastic wrap and put on it. Now, watercolor is, whenever you put watercolor on paper, you can't feel it. It's not like oil or acrylic, where if you went and put your hand on it later, you could feel the textures and all. So you do a fake texture. It's just an implied texture. And so anyway, it's an implied texture. And so you have to have all these little gimmicks and tricks. It's not as cheap as it sounds. It's really something that people really do. You have just gimmicks and tricks and things that make it look like there's texture going on. And most of the time when I start out, it's wet on wet. I'm using this very, very thinly because I want you to be able to see what I've done underneath it. That's one thing that's really important with these layers. It's very, very thin. And also, since watercolor can be picked up or moved, like if I wanted to erase something, I could wet it with clean water and blot it, wet it and blot it, and pretty soon it would, it would be lifted up, because like whenever your paper's like a palette. And so on here, on my regular palette, when I get ready, I let them dry out and they can stay there for years, which some of the colors do, because I have my favorite ones. But if you re-wet it, then you use it. And the same happens on here. I could re-wet this, and if I work it too much, I would end up blending it and turning it into mud instead of the pretty sparkling colors that separate here. So I'm going to... I did a little bit of where I didn't want to. Paper towels are wonderful, and once in a while I have experimented with being a little more. I do recycle a lot of them, and I use them up. I'll tell you that honestly, I really do. But you can use rags and wash them, let them dry, and redo them. You can get textures with your paper towels too. Oh, what I was saying is your paper is like a palette, because if you brush it too much, you pick up the previous paint that's there. So I'm going to be kind of fast whenever I put it down. So this is still wet on wet. Sometimes artists use a liquid frisket, which is sort of like a thinned down rubber cement, to paint areas that they want to leave out whenever they're painting, and that way they can kind of paint with abandon and get and leave the previous areas either all white or how they painted them. And I don't like doing that. It takes time to do it. It ruins your brush, even if you have dedicated brushes that are just for the frisket. But I hate messing up my brushes. So it's just as easy and just as fast to me to leave it dry.
So as you're working, a question, has it always been watercolor for you? Because I know artists sometimes go through
Okay, growing up, I painted and drew all the time since I was old enough to get into my dad's art supplies, and I was always and every little kid would pick up a pencil or crayon, and so as soon as I could hold one and get it on the paper, make connection with the paper I was drawing or doing some medium. As soon as I grew up, I started really doing a lot of watercolor. And my dad was doing mainly watercolor at that time. And so I took classes with him after I was an adult. I'd already had some years of college, and I took classes with him. And for once a week with a group, like kind of formally, semi-formally, for a year.
Wow.
And I didn't paint very much like him, but I liked what he did, and I painted a lot. Well, then I ended up doing all kinds of work. I love mixed media, and I've taught workshops on mixed media. And I had shows with mixed media and large canvases, and I've done oil, and I have taught oil and acrylic.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Both. But I always come back to watercolor, and now I'm trying to think how long, 2 or 3 decades at least, probably, I've been just almost exclusively doing watercolors. I love it. It doesn't seem like it's taken as seriously usually. I mean, there are even papers written on that. As canvas work. And at last, we have works that Michelangelo did, hundreds of years ago that are on paper.
I'm very curious about that too. I think you're probably right. People will take an acrylic or an oil, somebody who works in oil more seriously than watercolor, but I find watercolor so amazingly challenging just because you're working with wet on wet, just like you said. You can turn your background into mud if you're not careful. The way that you are able to create the backgrounds and then the figures that you add that somehow burst through that texture, that's skill.
It's fun. I mean, a lot of people think that it looks like watercolor is so hard. It's really not, because you get every medium that you do, it's more about learning how to fix your mistakes than it is being able to do it right the first time. And I found that with everything, whether it was printmaking or canvas work or anything.
Right.
So watercolor is easy. I'll tell you why, because watercolor does the work for you. Whenever I've been doing watercolor for a long time and then decide to do some opaque medium like acrylic or oil. Now, I really like the way oil feels and flows. I like how it smells. But watercolor kind of does the work for you. You get it wet and it just kind of flows and moves and does everything, and you can't be too rigid, because sometimes it kind of wants to do something else and you'll think, okay, I'll go and I'll do that this time. And then if it's not what you really had to do one thing, it was really in your mind, and you'd spent a long time getting it that way and it wanted to do something else, I save it and I start again. Because if it looks like it wants to be something else, it's going to be that. It's going to turn out a lot better. And watercolor just does that. It paints itself. And then if I've been doing it for a long time and I get ready to do some acrylic or oil, it feels like it just sits there. It feels like I'm fighting and wrestling with it. It feels very difficult. It's very difficult.
That's really interesting. You have to sometimes you have to allow the watercolor to work with you,
right,
as you're working with watercolor.
Right. I'm going to put a little shadow in here. This one, I've been doing a lot of deer women, and I like I'm really fascinated when there are myths and legends in different cultures, religions, countries that are similar. I think that's really exciting. I think it kind of reinforces to me that there must be some truth to it. Now, that's one way that you paint is wet on wet, and you get a hard edge every time you leave something dry. So that's what I've been working on, is this deer thing. And then here's one that has many layers on it, and I have the black of the crow with stars in it, and she is like up here scattering the stars. Keepers of the mystery. I have midnight winged messengers, mediators between the humans and the earth, the unknown. and I have that one, and then I have a moon, and then I'm really enchanted with stars and things in the sky, things that fly, and the comets. When I was in 4th grade, my teacher said that we were going to get to see Halley's Comet and how wonderful it was and the history of how it had scared people in the past. And I said, and she said, we were so lucky because we were going to see it in our lifetime and how wonderful it was going to be. And then we had Halley's Comet, and I remember going outside and thinking, I think I see it. I was so disappointed there. I was a grown-up then, but then with that last huge comet, now I forgot, Hale-Bopp. Oh my goodness, it was so huge. I couldn't believe that people were still just walking around driving cars and doing stuff, that you weren't just standing still with your mouth hanging up and looking up in the sky. It was so huge. It just took over everything. So I especially started adding a lot of comets to my work then. I did this right before the concert tonight. I just taped some paper together, drew, and made, what I basically did is make my own stencil, because this is another way that I like layering. So one of the ways I showed you is I have the color and then put down the salt, 2 salts on this, plastic wrap. I use credit cards and scrape it on and block print it on, just all kinds of ways of getting it on. And then you can paint layer upon layer, and each time do that same textural thing, like salts and plastic wrap and all. But then sometimes kind of close to the end, I'll decide to make my own stencil of something, and I could use a stencil like this and lay it down, and I'm going to splatter a toothbrush, and I would be sprinkling the negative space and get the positive shape of the toothbrush on whatever it was. What I do here is I draw something, and then I cut out the positive space, leave the negative as perfectly as I can. The inside I cut up into pieces as I'm trying to get all the little nooks and crannies. But then I have all this wonderful smooth negative, and I've again did a deer here, and I'm going to have to come back and reinforce it some way, since I'm putting it on before my last thing. I have all these really filthy pennies, which reminds me. Have any of y'all had Paxlovid? If you had COVID, and didn't it taste like a mouthful of dirty pennies? Yeah. Yeah. I had all the vaccinations and all the boosters and all that. But I'm grateful that it wasn't horrible. And I'm grateful for the Paxlovid. But yeah, dirty pennies, I've got lots of those always. And I make little weights to hold this down. This is a one-time, quick handmade, drawn, cut out with scissors, little stencil. And I use little things around. I've used little bobby pins or anything to hold some of the little pieces down that might not stay down where I want them.
You guys are all going to have to go watch this video when it gets up on our YouTube channel. I feel very naughty being the only one that gets to watch this magic happening at the moment. It's really amazing.
I hope I'm describing this well enough. And then if you get a chance then, during our intermission or at the end or something, you can come by, and after having heard me talk about it, you can tell a little bit. I also wrote my 3... Whatever I'm doing at the time is always my favorite. It's kind of like, but right now, my favorite things I've been doing, I'm doing some sun goddesses, which is also one of those things that you find myths all around the world, which is unusual because almost always a sun god is male. That's the sun's male, the moon's female. But there are several instances, and I've written about that too. I did personally write most of those, but it's based on just stuff that I picked up off the internet because I was really wanting to find out about it quickly, without the time for doing any really research. But I do tell what I've learned and picked up and put together about the sun goddesses, and I've been painting those, and I hope you'll get to come to the show here I've already done. I have a little one, I think, over in the portfolio that was a little study for a big one I'm doing. And then speaking of canvases, if I have time, I'm going to try to mount some of my watercolors on some canvases too, because there are a lot of artists who do that. And you still get that beautiful translucent layering effect, but yet they're going to look important on canvas. Okay, and it's okay if it's a little bit pieces standing up here. It doesn't make a perfect sharp-edged stencil, but it will still, and you can use any color, but I usually use gray because that looks mystical. And sometimes if I have a lot of color on one, I'll use white, which don't ever put white on your palette because it turns all these beautiful translucent colors to gouache. It turns it all into opaque medium, and you won't be able to see through it if it exits. One little drop will mix in with that and ruin it. So if you're going to use white, keep it on a little piece of saran wrap or plastic table or something.
I never thought of that.
So I get some paint, and I want it just dark enough, and I try it on this piece of scrap paper, paper towel, and it's your first few drops are not going to be fine enough, and when it gets fine enough, then you can start splattering. And if you, like, let's say you did a painting and you finished it, and then you thought, I really need something up here. What I could put a little sun or moon there. You can lay a round disc there and just sprinkle around it, and that way you don't have to mess up any painting that you've done there before. You can just stick that on there, and you've got one. And do this. Use your toothbrush to speckle it on.
I love learning these tricks. My brain overcomplicates all of these processes all the time, and I'm watching you do it going, duh.
It's just it's so much fun.
It's so fun looking, and so I say simple. So what's simple is flicking the paint off the brush. What's not so simple is having the eye for the color and the placement of the stencil and a vision for what the final product might look like.
Well, I was very fortunate to get to grow up around art. And you know how, have you ever, I don't know if you've ever done this, have you ever thought, well, I don't have much to spray on, I know you're supposed to do it indoors, but I'm just going to do this one little spot right here and put a bunch of newspapers down, and then the edge of your newspapers, you can see the square there, and then on top of your refrigerator later on, you'll find it. So even when you're doing this is an aerosol and it doesn't go everywhere, but it's going to go bigger than you want. I've gotten some little splatters on her, and it's still easy to do. It does, and I'm probably going to have to do some of this again, so I'm not going to make it real heavy, just so that you get the idea. It's one more way to get some really wonderful layers and detailing down.
So there's got to be a story of like the biggest accidental mess you've ever made.
Well, oh my goodness, I have two really good on accidents. One of them, I was a little bit upset this one day about something, and I'd done this butterfly woman with hair. It was one of the first ones I do, with real long hair coming down and layers of sheer wings or butterflies, that she just emerged from the chrysalis, and they were so wet. And it was blue background and orange, and I love those real strong color combinations like that that you get from complementary colors. And I was really upset, and I got my brush really loaded with this Winsor blue, which is phthalo blue, and Windsor's brand name for their phthalo blue, and it's real staining. Most of my favorite ones are staining, and I went over it real dark across the wings, and it was so awful. I was so upset. It only hurt me, and I took it over to the sink in the kitchen, and I just started flooding it with water and rubbing it, and I ended up getting most of it off, and on top of that, it made it look kind of, butterflies have that, and moths have that powdery, soft look. That's how this looked then, just so, and I wouldn't have gotten it if I wouldn't have been rubbing it and trying to get that color off, and so it had a real special look, texture to it that I wouldn't ordinarily get. And then the other, probably a good accident, people, that Ross just talks about happy accidents, and they talked about happy accidents even way before that, and in watercolor a lot, because that's really going with it. Doing what watercolors does best is relaxing. And so I was having a show, and artists always think, the last piece I do is going to be the best one. I've got to finish this one up. I can't just go with what I have. I've got to do, this last one's going to be wonderful. And so I had the frame at the gallery in the matte cut, and it was a full sheet watercolor, 22 by 30, which is the size of this one. And it was all finished, except I do my darkest details at the end. Usually you do that in watercolors, your very darkest ones. And on this one, I'll tell you, I take pride that I rarely ever would use ink. But this was quite a while ago. And I mixed up some other colors, a brown and a blue, to make my blacks. But I was using some ink on this, and I was doing the last detail. And at the front center of that big painting, I dropped a blob of ink right in the front of it. It was already had a title card and the matte cut and the glass. All I had to do was go there and put it in, take off the back and put it in and all. And I just thought, what am I going to do? I'm so upset. I can't believe it. What am I going to do? And I took it and I thought, I think I can make kind of a rock shape out of it. And fortunately, it had people in it, but it had scenery and trees way in the background. And then I thought, I can't just have one big black rock right there. I'm going to put just this little white rock behind it, right behind here, and I put a little bit of shading behind it. Now I put some grass and sprinkles and little stuff and all. And I thought, well, it's kind of glaring, those two rocks right up front, but I've got to go with it. It's almost time for the opening now. And so I took off up there and got it in just in time for people to come in. It was the very first one that sold. And the owner of the gallery, well, I like to say, you know how they say there are no accidents and things happen for a reason and all, and sometimes it's our subconscious. I'd love to be able to give myself that much credit. But anyway, the woman who bought it said she wanted to talk to me, and so the gallery owner took me over there and said, she said, this is just so beautiful. I love the painting. And then on top of it all, that you would have, I don't know, the idea of taking a black rock and a white rock front and center so boldly in front in the most important part, and doing that's what made him so I just said thank you.
All right, Connie. So we're about to take a break. And is it okay, you're going to leave this one laying here for people to be able to come have a peek at? That's unbelievable. Look what you just did.
Take the brochure with you, too, whenever you go to the table.
Oh, my goodness. Guys, that all just happened while we're sitting here chatting. All right. Thank you, Connie. Thank you very much for showing that to us. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.